In this module, we'll discuss our vSphere environment. We'll talk a little bit about the different components that make up this environment, and then we'll go in a little more detail and speak about the different types of hypervisors. You have your type 1 and type 2 hypervisor. But to start with, let's just do a little overview on the different components that make up our vSphere environment. As you notice, I've listed 5 of them here. Let's start with the hypervisor, or in our case, the ESXi. This is the virtualization layer that runs on the hardware, and it is the basis for our virtualization infrastructure. So the purpose of the hypervisor really is to create an environment so as to run virtual machines. The operating system running on your machine here would not know that it's being run virtually. It would assume that it's being run on your physical or on your hardware, sorry. We'll call this the guest OS, that operating system, and the machine that the hypervisor is on, we'll call that the host. So keep in mind also the host could be a virtual machine. So you could have a VM running on a host which is running in another host. This is the basis for what you call nested virtualization. The second component here, the centralized management console. This is implemented in what's called a vCenter server. So it's basically a centralized console for pooling and managing of your resources on your ESXi host and for managing the resources too of VMs. It utilizes a backend database. So this database stores all the information concerning our host and VM. And the vCenter server is basically deployed as a vCenter server appliance, which is supplied by VMware, or a vCenter server application, which runs on top of a Windows server. So that's the way we would be doing it in this demonstration, or in our demonstrations here. So traditionally, you would have your vCenter server support like more hosts, more VM than your vCenter server appliance. But what's new with vSphere 6.0 is that the vCenter server appliance could now support 1,000 hosts and 10,000 VMs. So it basically could scale as well as the Windows-based vCenter server. And it seems like this is the direction where VMware is going with this. Since with every release of vSphere, there has been enhancement in terms of the feature set of what the appliance supports. So thirdly here, we'll talk a bit about our management client. There are 2 ways of managing our infrastructure. You would have your traditional vSphere client, which is basically a .NET Windows client, or what you call a desktop client. This was deployed, or used to be deployed on a Windows installation, so you could not have run this on some Linux installation. You had to do it on Windows. If you're still going to deploy our vCenter server within a ESXi host, we'll need to use the traditional client to do that. Because at least we'll need to at least get a vCenter server up and running before we could connect our web client to it. Let's just bear in mind too that the web client only works with connecting to our vCenter server that is managing our host. We can't take our client and point it directly to our web client and point it directly to one of the hosts and manage it. It does not work like that. So some of the requirements for the web client, we would need to install Adobe Flash, and this works basically with any of your traditional web browser, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Google Chrome. Just have the latest version on it and this should work. We should bear in mind too that the new features that are available in vSphere 6.0, we could only manage these with the vSphere web client and not the desktop client. Fourth in our list there is storage. We'll need some sort of shared storage or local storage in our infrastructure. In most cases, to capitalize on most of VMware high availability feature, DRS, and those things, you would need some sort of shared storage. And lastly, we need some sort of networking in our infrastructure or virtualized networking. And this would comprise of your virtual switches or your standard virtual switches or your distributed virtual switches. But we'll have separate modules where we will discuss all of these in detail. Also, I should mention that in vSphere 6.0, the installer for the inventory service, the vSphere web client, and auto deploy, all of these are installed with the vCenter server. It's just a matter of enabling the services for some of them within vCenter. For example, the auto deploy. It should also be noted that the vSphere Update Manager is still a separate product. They didn't bundle this like some of the other services. So let's talk a bit about our hypervisors, our hypervisor type, sorry. As I mentioned previously, the hypervisor is basically the software that facilitates the running of virtual machines. So we have two types of hypervisor, our type 1 and our type 2. So our type 1 hypervisor, or bare metal hypervisor, this is where the hypervisor is running directly on the hardware and the virtual machine being on top of that layer. So I'll just draw this out in a little bit so you guys could have a better idea of what I'm talking about. Examples of type 1 hypervisors would include ESXi, Hyper-V from Microsoft, Citrix and Server, KVM. All of these would fit into the category of a bare metal hypervisor, seeing that they run directly on top of the hardware. So the hypervisor controls the hardware directly, and your guest OS that runs on your VM would run as a process on that host. So that's about that for type 1 hypervisor. Type 2 hypervisors now. So this would require a host operating system. It does not run directly on the hardware. Instead, the hypervisor abstracts the guest OS from the host operating system. So the hypervisor in this case is installed as an application on the host operating system, and the guest OS runs on top of that. So some examples of this would be VMware Workstation, VMware Player, Oracle VirtualBox, VMware Fusion. Those are a couple I could think of that falls under this category. So let me just pull up this here so I could draw this out. So let's say this is our hardware. So let's just draw the type 2 hypervisor first and say we run VMware Workstation here. So we have our VMware Workstation here. And then on top of this, we run our ESXi. Let's just put 3 of them here. ESXi. And your infrastructure might vary. You might have a cluster here and then run your VM and stuff like that. But basically what happens above here is you have VM. So VM. So this would be a typical example of a type 2 hypervisor. The bare metal hypervisor. So with your bare metal, you would have your hardware. Okay, so you'd have your hardware there, and then you would have your hypervisor here. Bear in mind the installation for the hypervisor is pretty small. It's just like 130 megs, so it does not use a lot of resource here. So that's your hypervisor there. And then, excuse me, on top of this now you would have your VM. So that's it in a nutshell there.